Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, October 1887. The roses were already dying. Willa Mae Ashford noticed it the moment she stepped into the garden, the way the petals curled inward like small fists, the color draining from red to rust at the edges. Her mother had always said roses in October were a stubborn thing. They refused to accept the cold until the cold had already won. Willa pressed her palms against the handle of the iron spade and drove it into the earth. She was 22 years old. In 3 weeks, she would be married. The Voss estate sat on the edge of Rittenhouse Square, 4 stories of gray stone and dark windows, the kind of house that swallowed light rather than reflected it. She had been here a dozen times since her mother accepted Senator Orrin Voss's social invitation 8 months prior, and still the house made her uncomfortable in a way she could never quite name. As if the walls had absorbed too many secrets over too many years and simply had nowhere left to put them. But the garden was different. The garden was open. The garden had Harlan Voss had asked her to select a location for the rose bushes his mother's horticulturalist was sending from a nursery in Connecticut. A wedding gift, he said. Something living. Something that would grow. He had smiled when he said it. Harlan always smiled. It was a careful smile measured at the edges, never quite reaching the amber of his eyes. Willa drove the spade down again. She was not thinking about Harlan's smile. She was thinking about her father. Solomon Ashford had been dead for 7 months. Lung disease, the doctor said. It moved fast, they said. By the time the family understood the severity, he was already gone, leaving behind a house on Chestnut Street, a modest legal practice, and debts that had appeared from nowhere like cracks in old plaster. Within 2 months of the burial, the house was gone. Within 3, the practice had been absorbed by a larger firm. Senator Orrin Voss, an acquaintance of her father's from the Pennsylvania Bar Association, had appeared at precisely the right moment, with precisely the right offer, a merger of families, a clearing of debts, and a future secured. Willa had not been consulted. She had been informed. The spade struck something hard. She pulled back, adjusted the angle, tried again. Not a rock. The resistance had a different quality to it, something that gave slightly before it held. She pressed the blade in from the side, prying gently. The soil shifted. She knelt down and moved the loose dirt with her hands. The smell reached her first. Not rot, that was the strange thing, not the smell of something recent. This was older than that. Mineral, chemical, the smell of earth that had absorbed something it was never meant to hold. Her fingers touched something curved and smooth. She cleared more soil. A dome shape emerged from the black earth. She recognized it before her mind would allow her to name it. The eye sockets were the worst part, not because they were frightening, but because they were so still. Everything else in the garden moved. The leaves, the late insects, the wind coming off the square. But those sockets were perfectly, absolutely still. A skull. Around the cervical vertebrae, the delicate chain of bones where a neck had once been a necklace still hung. A thin gold chain with a locket. Willa's hands shook as she lifted it free. The locket opened easily as if it had been waiting. Inside a photograph, the size of a thumbnail. A young woman in a white dress. A bridal portrait. The inscription on the back of the locket read, "To Margaret, forever and always. H.V." Willa sat back on her heels in the dirt. She told herself to stop. To stand up, walk inside, call for the groundskeeper, say nothing. People found old things buried in old gardens. It meant nothing. It could mean nothing. But her hands were already moving again deeper to the side where the displaced earth had a different texture. And there, 18 inches below the first, lay the second. This skeleton wore a silver ring on the bone of its right hand. The inscription inside the band was small but legible in the fading afternoon light. For Eleanor, constant as the stars. H.V., 2 women, 2 pieces of jewelry with the initials H.V., 2 bodies in the garden of the man she was scheduled to marry in 21 days. Willa pressed the back of her hand to her mouth and breathed through her nose until the dizziness passed. Then she stood, tucked the locket and the ring into her coat pocket, smoothed her skirt, walked calmly back through the garden gate, and entered the house through the servant's door. She went straight to the library. She had seen Harlan in this room only twice, but both times she had noticed the way he positioned himself near the east bookshelf. Not reading, standing close to it, comfortable in a way that had nothing to do with the books. She ran her fingers along the spines. Behind a collection of legal treatises wedged flat against the shelf's back panel was a thin journal bound in brown calfskin. She pulled it free. His handwriting was precise, orderly, the handwriting of a man who prided himself on control. She sat at the reading table and opened it. The first entry was dated 4 years prior. She read it. Then she read the second. Then she closed the journal and set it on the table and stared at the window for a long time. The light had gone from gold to gray while she was in the garden. Through the glass, she could see the bare branches of the elm trees moving against the October sky. There were no words in her head. Not yet. There was only the sensation of the ground having disappeared beneath her feet, of falling through something she had believed was solid. The journal was specific. That was what made it worse. Not raving, not confused. Specific, methodical, almost administrative. The first wife, Margaret, had discovered something in the cellar and threatened to go to the authorities. The second, Eleanor, had lasted 14 months before the same threat was made. In both cases, his father, Senator Orrin Voss, had helped with what the journal called the necessary resolution. In both cases, the garden. The final entry read, "The third will need to be selected more carefully. No family with means. No connections who will ask questions. Someone desperate. Someone who has already lost the protection of a father. Someone like Willa." She set the journal back exactly where she found it. She wiped the shelf with her sleeve. She walked upstairs to her borrowed room in the East Wing, sat at the writing desk, and spent 3 minutes doing nothing but breathing. Then she began to plan. She had 21 days, possibly fewer if Harlan suspected what she had found. The wedding was scheduled for November 15th. November 15th was the day she would officially stop being a problem and become, in the eyes of Pennsylvania law, property. She pulled open the small drawer in the writing desk. Inside, pressed between the pages of a flower book she had been using since early September, was a piece of newspaper she had torn out 6 weeks ago and kept without quite knowing why. At the time, it had seemed absurd, almost funny. Now it looked like the only open door. The advertisement was small, 4 lines placed in the back pages of a San Francisco paper that had somehow ended up in a Philadelphia lending library. 4 brothers seek one wife. Ranchers. Wyoming Territory. Hard-working men seeking a woman of strong character. Respond to Callister Ranch, Dead Man's Canyon, care of South Pass City Post Office. She read it 4 times. Then she took a clean sheet of paper and wrote the most important letter of her life. She wrote honestly. She saw no other choice. She described herself plainly, 22, educated in difficult circumstances, willing to work, willing to learn. She asked plainly what the arrangement required. She did not exaggerate her qualities or conceal her situation. She enclosed her engagement portrait, the profile shot, tidy hair, careful expression, and added at the very bottom, almost as an afterthought, because it was the truest thing she had ever written: "I have nowhere else to go." She mailed it the next morning, told Harlan's housekeeper she was visiting the lending library, and returned before noon. Then she waited. Each evening she came down to dinner and sat across from Harlan Voss and watched him the way you watch something at the edge of a dark room, trying to see its shape without letting it know you are looking. He was handsome in the architectural way of men who have never been denied anything. Strong jaw, dark hair always neat, clothes that fit with the precision of money. And that smile. Always that smile. Once during the second week, he cornered her in the hallway near the east staircase. He stood too close and spoke too quietly, his hand resting on the wall beside her head. "Soon," he said. His voice was pleasant. His eyes were not. "Soon this will all be settled, Willa, and then you'll understand what I require from a wife." She looked at him directly. She kept her expression mild. "Of course," she said. "I look forward to it." She went upstairs and sat on the edge of her bed until her hands stopped shaking. The reply came 19 days after she sent her letter. South Pass City postmark. Heavy paper folded once. The handwriting was not elegant, but it was direct, the penmanship of someone who spent their life outdoors and valued function over form. "Miss Ashford, we are 4 brothers. We do not waste words, so we will not waste yours. We are looking for a woman who can share a life, not a woman who needs one to be built for her. If you are what your letter suggests, honest, capable, clear-eyed, then come. Arrive South Pass City by December 10th. We will be there. The Reverend will marry us December 12th. We are not gentlemen, but we are honorable ones. Cade Callister." She read it 7 times. She sat with the word honorable for a long time. Then she went to Senator Orrin Voss's study. She had memorized the combination to his safe from watching him open it twice. 18 right, 4 left, 29 right. The date of some court victory she didn't care to remember. The man was nothing if not consistent. The safe opened. Inside stacks of bills, legal documents, a leather satchel of correspondence, and at the back a folder marked with her father's name. She took the folder out and read it at the desk. It took her 11 minutes to understand what she was looking at. She had spent enough years watching her father work through contracts to recognize the structure, and it took her 11 minutes because the language was deliberately obscured, drafted to read as routine while concealing something far from it. The marriage contract between Harlan Voss and Willa Mae Ashford contained a property transfer clause buried in the third schedule of the third appendix. In language that referenced 3 other documents by number rather than name, it specified that upon completion of the marriage ceremony, all assets currently held in the Ashford Estate Trust, including the Chestnut Street property, the legal practice receivables, and a private investment account she had not known existed, would transfer permanently and irrevocably to the Voss family holding company. She read it again. Her father's debts had not appeared from nowhere. They had been manufactured. The legal practice had not collapsed. It had been absorbed through a series of transactions that, reading carefully, bore the signature of Orrin Voss's law firm on each page. The house had been sold under pressure from a creditor who 3 steps removed was a shell company controlled by a Voss associate. Solomon Ashford had not lost his fortune. It had been taken from him piece by piece until there was nothing left and no one to protect his daughter. And then the offer had come, a merger of families, a future secured. Harlan Voss was not a killer with a side interest in finance. He was a financial instrument with a side interest in killing. Senator Orrin Voss had designed all of it. Willa took $200 from the cash in the safe. It was a fraction of what had been stolen. She thought of it as partial recovery of property, not theft, because that was precisely what it was. She took her mother's ring from a small box on the senator's desk, a piece her father had given her mother the year they married, which the senator had claimed as part of the debt settlement. She left everything else exactly as she found it. She spent the rest of that night in her room packing what she could feel would fit in a single small trunk: 3 dresses, 2 nightgowns, 6 books she could not bear to leave. Her father's Bible, the ring, the folder, the letter from Cade Callister. By the time the house grew quiet, she was ready. She took the servants' stairs. She avoided the 4th step, which groaned, and the 8th, which squeaked. She had been memorizing the sounds of this house for weeks without knowing why. She walked out the back gate and into the October night and did not look back. The train left Philadelphia at 6 in the morning. She sat in a second-class compartment, her trunk stored overhead, her hands folded in her lap, and watched the city dissolve into suburbs and then into open country. The October fields were brown and flat. The sky was the pale gray of old pewter. She felt nothing for a long time, not relief, not fear, not grief. Just the particular stillness of a person who has already made the hardest decision and is now simply living inside it. On the second day, a woman settled into the seat across from her. She was somewhere in her mid-50s, compact and deliberate in her movements, with silver hair pinned in a practical knot and eyes the color of worn wood, not glamorous, not soft, but kind in a way that had clearly been earned through significant difficulty. She carried a canvas bag, a wicker basket covered with a cloth, and the self-possession of a woman who had seen enough of the world to stop being surprised by it. Her name was Myrtle Beckham. She said it the way people introduced themselves in small towns, with the assumption that the name would mean something to whoever she was speaking to, and the complete absence of concern if it didn't. "Where are you headed?" Myrtle asked. "South Pass City," Willa said. "Wyoming territory." Myrtle looked at her for a moment, not rudely but carefully, the way a woman looks at another woman when she is trying to determine whether concern is warranted. "Alone, I'm going to be married there," Willa said. Myrtle set down her basket, to whom Willa hesitated for only a moment. "4 brothers," she said, "the Callister boys. I answered an advertisement." There was a silence. Then Myrtle said, "I know." Willa went very still. "I know," Myrtle said again more quietly, "because I placed that advertisement." The train swayed around a long curve. The winter fields outside shifted past. Willa looked at the woman across from her, this stranger in a wool coat with a wicker basket, and waited. Myrtle set her hands on her knees and told the truth simply the way she seemed to do everything. The Callister boys had been her neighbors once years ago before they moved deeper into the mountains. She had known their mother Dorothea Callister until Dorothea died of fever in 1879. After that, the four brothers had slowly turned inward away from South Pass City, away from people, away from everything that required softness or trust. Good men, capable men. Men who had been handed enough betrayal to make isolation seem reasonable. She had placed the advertisement because she believed something was dying in them that didn't have to. And because Dorothea, in the last weeks before she died, had made Myrtle promise to look after her boys. Not smother them, not manage them, just look after. So Myrtle had gone through every letter that arrived at the South Pass City Post Office over the course of 6 weeks. She had read each one looking for a specific quality. Not beauty, not youth, not domestic skill. She was looking for someone who had already survived something. Someone who knew what it was to lose everything and still make a decision. She found it in Willa's letter. I read it 3 times, Myrtle said. Then I bought my ticket. Willa stared at her. You were going to South Pass City regardless. I lived there, child. But I moved my departure up 2 weeks to be on this train. To see you with my own eyes before anyone else did. What did you see? Willa asked. Myrtle almost smiled. Someone who doesn't need saving, which is exactly what those men need. Willa looked out the window for a while. The prairie had begun, flat and immense and utterly indifferent. They know I'm coming, Willa asked. Cade wrote back the day after he received your letter. Myrtle paused. He wrote back the same day. Willa turned that over in her mind. The man who did not waste words writing back the same day. The train carried them west for 4 more days. Willa told Myrtle only the parts that mattered: the bones in the garden, the journal, the contract, the safe. She did not tell it dramatically. She told it the way it happened, quietly in sequence, one fact after another. Myrtle listened without interrupting. When Willa finished, Myrtle looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, Your father, he was a good man. He was the best man I ever knew, Willa said. Then we will make sure it counts for something, Myrtle said. South Pass City appeared on December 10th like something a child might draw, a single main street. Wooden buildings weathered pale by wind and altitude, mountains on every side with their peaks already deep in winter snow. The air was thin and cold and clean in a way that Philadelphia air never was, and breathing it felt like drinking from a cold stream after a long drought. Willa stepped off the platform with her trunk and stood still for a moment, letting the reality of the place settle on her. Myrtle appeared at her shoulder. Post office first, she said. Let them know you've arrived. The clerk at the post office grinned when Willa gave her name. The Callister brothers had been checking for word of her arrival every day for the past week, he said. They were at the livery stable now, preparing the wagon for the journey to Dead Man's Canyon. The livery was 50 yards down the main street. Willa walked the distance, slowly aware of something building in her chest, not quite fear and not quite excitement, but something that lived between the two in the territory that belongs to things that cannot be undone. She smelled the place before she reached it. Hay and leather and horses and wood smoke. She stepped through the wide doorway into the dim interior. 4 men stood near a loaded wagon. Her mind did not immediately comprehend what she was seeing. They were identical. Not similar, not like family resemblance, but absolutely architecturally identical, as if the same pattern had been cut 4 times from the same cloth. Tall in a way that reorganized your sense of scale, well over 6 feet each, with broad shoulders that blocked the light coming through the stable doors. Dark brown hair, amber eyes that turned toward her simultaneously as if pulled by the same invisible thread. They were working when she arrived, chopping and stacking wood-loading supplies, the kind of labor that revealed rather than concealed the bodies doing it. Shirts pushed up to the elbows despite the cold. Hands that were calloused and scarred and large in the way that hands become when they have spent years in the actual world. She stood in the doorway and looked at all 4 of them and understood for the first time fully what she had agreed to. One of them set down his axe and stepped forward. The scars on his forearms were the first thing she noticed up close. Rope burns mostly, and a long white line across his left forearm that suggested a knife rather than an accident. His face was the same as his brother's: sharp jaw, high cheekbones, that amber gaze, but something in the set of his expression was different. Deliberate. like a man who had learned to keep his face still because too many people had once been able to read it. Miss Ashford. His voice was exactly what his handwriting had suggested, direct without performance. I'm Cade. He extended his hand. She took it. His palm swallowed hers. He shook it once firmly and released. These are my brothers. He stepped back slightly. Flint, Soren, Thatcher. Flint, broad across the shoulders, restless energy even standing still, gave her a nod that contained something almost like challenge. Not hostile, just testing. Soren, the same face, but with something gentler in the eyes, a quality that seemed physiological, rather than merely emotional, inclined his head and said quietly, Welcome, Miss Ashford. You had a safe journey, I hope. Thatcher was the last. He was leaning against the wagon with his arms crossed, in a grin that seemed structural, as if his face had simply settled into that position over years of use. We've been arguing about where to put your trunk, he said. I won the argument. It goes in the back. Myrtle, standing just behind Willa, made a sound that might have been suppressed amusement. Cade looked at Willa steadily. The Reverend can marry us tomorrow morning if you're ready. We'll stay in town tonight. Mrs. Beckham has a room for you. Willa looked at him, at Flint, at Soren, at Thatcher. 4 men she had never met. 4 strangers with amber eyes and the kind of hands that told the truth about the lives they lived. She thought about the bones in the garden. She thought about the journal and the contract and the names engraved in gold and silver on jewelry that had been buried in the dark earth beneath rose bushes. She thought about the letter that had said, We are not gentle men, but we are honorable ones. I'm ready, she said. That night in the small clean room above Myrtle's kitchen, Willa lay on a narrow bed and looked at the ceiling and did something she had not done since she was a child. She talked to her father, not out loud, just in the place behind words where the real conversations happen. She told him what she had found in the garden. She told him about the contract she had read in Orrin Voss's safe. She told him she had begun to suspect something she was not yet ready to say plainly. She told him she was going to find out the truth. And then she said goodnight and closed her eyes and slept. The ceremony was held the following morning in the small building Reverend Josiah Pruitt used for weekly services, a converted prospector's cabin with rough-hewn pews and a pine-board altar and windows that let in more December wind than light. A handful of townspeople attended out of curiosity. Myrtle stood at the side with her hands folded. The 4 Callister brothers had made efforts. Their shirts were clean. Their hair was combed back from their faces, revealing the full lines of their identical features. Standing in a row at the altar, they were a thing almost impossible to look at directly, the way certain landscapes are too much of the same powerful thing in one place. Willa walked the short aisle in her best dress, the cream one with the lace collar, her mother's ring on her right hand. She was not trembling. She noticed that about herself. She had expected to tremble. Reverend Pruitt was a practical man. He opened with a brief acknowledgement that the ceremony was unusual, that the law recognized only one union, the one between Willa and Cade Callister, who would sign the certificate, but that in the sight of God in this community, she was binding herself to all 4 brothers. Do you understand and accept this? He asked the room. We do. 4 voices, 1 sound. It moved through her chest like a low note struck on a large instrument. Miss Ashford, Reverend Pruitt looked at her. Do you take these 4 men as your lawfully wedded husbands, to honor in sickness and in health for as long as you all shall live? Willa looked at each of them. Cade still as bedrock, watching her with those amber eyes that gave nothing away and somehow gave everything. Flint, who could not quite stand still even at his own wedding weight, shifting slightly, jaw set. Soren, who looked at her the way a man looks at something he intends to protect. Thatcher grinning. Of course Thatcher was grinning. She had known him less than 24 hours, and she already understood that Thatcher's grin was not frivolous. It was how he chose to face things. I do, she said. The vows were plain. Cade spoke first. I vow to be your burn. I vow to protect you, to provide for you, to be honest with you even when the truth is hard. His voice was low and even, the kind of voice that does not require volume to carry weight. Flint, I vow to be there, always, whatever it costs. Soren, I vow to take care with you. In every sense of that word, Thatcher's grin softened into something more real when he spoke. I vow to remind you that life is still worth laughing at, even on the bad days. He paused, especially on the bad days. Willa's vow was short. She had written it the night before and decided against anything elaborate. I vow to trust you, she said. I vow to be honest. I vow to work alongside you, not behind you. And I vow not to run when things get hard. It was Cade who kissed her first. He bent down from his considerable height and pressed his lips to hers with a gentleness that seemed almost at odds with the size of him. Brief, certain, a statement rather than a question. Then Flint, who kissed her with the same restless energy that lived in the rest of him, decisive, warm, present. Soren held her face in both of his large hands with a tenderness so careful it made her eyes sting. Thatcher kissed her last and pulled back an inch and said quietly, so only she could hear, "You're going to be all right, Willa Callister." She believed him. The journey to Dead Man's Canyon took 6 hours by wagon. The road climbed steadily into the mountain's narrow and switched back on itself with drop-offs on one side and rock walls on the other. Willa sat on the bench between Cade and Thatcher. Flint and Soren rode behind. The landscape was extraordinary, savage, and white, and enormous in a way that put human concerns in their proper proportion. Halfway up, Cade said without looking at her, "You can still change your mind. We'd take you back to South Pass City. No hard feelings." Willa looked at the mountains ahead of them. "I'm not going back," she said. He nodded once. "That's settled then." The cabin appeared as the sun began dropping behind the western peaks, larger than she had imagined. Solid logs properly chinked against the cold smoke rising from the chimney light in the windows. Someone had come ahead to start the fire. They helped her down from the wagon, and when her cold, stiffened legs faltered on the last step, 4 pairs of hands steadied her so quickly she had barely registered the misstep before it was corrected. Inside was warm. Fireplace the width of 1 full wall. A table chair, shelves of books, furs on the floor. Everything practical and nothing wasted. Cade showed her the bedroom last, a single door at the far end of the main room. The bed was enormous, custom built, she realized, wide enough for 5 people. She stood in the doorway and looked at it. "I know what this is," she said quietly. "I understand what I agreed to." Cade stood beside her. His voice when he spoke was lower than before. "Tonight nothing is required. We want you to understand this. You're exhausted. You're in a strange place. Nothing is required tonight." She turned to look up at him. He was watching her not with patience exactly, but with something more active than that. Respect, maybe. The respect of a man who understands that some things cannot be rushed. "What is required eventually?" she asked. His amber eyes met hers steadily. "Honesty," he said. "Always. Everything else can be learned." That night, the 5 of them sat together at the table and ate the meal Soren had prepared: venison stew, hot bread, coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in. They talked. Not deeply, not yet, but in the way of people beginning to map each other, what they valued, what they had survived, where they were tender if you pressed. Thatcher asked about Philadelphia. Willa told him about her father, about the law practice, the lending library, the pressed flower hobby that had led her to a certain advertisement in a certain newspaper. Flint was quiet through most of it, but asked at the end, "Was he a good man, your father?" "The best I knew," she said. Flint nodded and said nothing else. But something shifted in the way he held himself after that. Later, when the lamp was low and the fire had burned to coals, and the cold outside had hardened to something serious, Willa lay in the enormous bed, surrounded by the warmth of 4 sleeping men, and stared at the log ceiling and held 2 truths at once. She was safe. For the first time in 7 months, possibly longer, she was safe. And somewhere in the city she had left behind a man with a careful smile and a garden full of secrets, was going to notice very soon that she was gone. She had 21 days before the wedding date. The wedding was now behind her. What came next was another matter entirely. She closed her eyes. The wind moved against the cabin walls. Deep in the canyon, the cold settled in, like a patient thing, the kind that knows it will win eventually, and so sees no reason to hurry. Willa May Ashford. Willa May Callister now let sleep take her. She was 22 years old. She had nowhere left to run. That meant only one direction remained. Forward. The first snow came 3 days after the wedding. Willa stood at the cabin window and watched it fall. Not the tentative, apologetic snow of eastern cities, but the real article, the kind the mountains produced without ceremony or warning. Thick and absolute. Within 2 hours, the canyon was unrecognizable. Within 4, the world had been reduced to the cabin, the barn, the woodpile, and 30 feet of visibility in every direction. She found she was not afraid of it. That surprised her. She had expected the isolation to press in on her the way the walls of the Voss estate had pressed. But Dead Man's Canyon in winter was something else entirely. Not confinement, scale. You felt small against it, yes. But the smallness was honest. It had nothing to do with what anyone thought of you or wanted from you. It was simply the truth of where you stood in relation to the mountains. And Willa had spent enough of her life managing other people's versions of her to find the truth, even an indifferent one, almost restful. She learned the rhythms of the place quickly. Dawn came late, this deep in the canyon, the light arriving gradually feeling its way down the rock walls like a careful hand. Cade and Flint were always first up already at the barn or the woodpile before she had dressed. Soren cooked breakfast with the focused precision of a man who believed that feeding people was a form of medicine. Thatcher appeared last, hair still disordered, wearing that grin, like he had put it on specifically to annoy his brothers, and somehow the room was better for it. The days had a structure that she had not expected to find satisfying, and did. Wood needed splitting and stacking, animals needed feeding and checking, snow needed clearing from the roof edges and the barn doors, traps needed checking, leather needed mending, the root cellar needed organizing against the long season ahead. There was always work, and the work was always concrete. You could see what you had done at the end of the day, which was a particular kind of satisfaction she had not known she was missing. She worked alongside them. She did not ask permission, and they did not suggest she might prefer to do otherwise. By the end of the first week, this had become simply the way things were. But she was also watching. That was the other thing she had always done. Her father had taught her early, and without making a lesson of it, that the most reliable intelligence came from observation rather than interrogation. People revealed themselves in small things, in what they reached for first, in how they responded to difficulty, in what they laughed at. Cade she read as the kind of man whose silences were not empty. He thought before he spoke always, and the pause before his words was not hesitation but selection. He was choosing from everything he could say exactly what needed to be said. He was the one the brothers looked to when something required a decision, not because he demanded it, but because they trusted the quality of his thinking. He was also the one who twice in that first week she caught reading by the fire after the others had gone to bed. Both times he had looked up, neither embarrassed nor defensive, just acknowledging her presence before returning to the page. Flint was motion. He could not be still for long without it costing him something. He chopped wood with a ferocity that suggested he was working something out, and probably had been working it out for years. He was the quickest to anger and the quickest to release it, which meant his moods were storms that passed rather than weather systems that settled in. He was also, she discovered, privately funny, dry, sparse, and delivered so deadpan that the first time he made her laugh, she actually startled herself. Soren was the easiest to be near. There was a stillness to him that was different from Cade's. Cade's stillness was disciplined. Soren's was something he had arrived at through a longer road, and there were moments when a sound caught him off guard, or when the conversation touched certain subjects when she could see him visibly returning from somewhere else. He never spoke of it. She did not ask. But she filed it away with the careful attention she gave to everything. And Thatcher. Thatcher was the one who talked to her the most in those first weeks, asking questions with the genuine curiosity of a man who found other people's lives legitimately interesting rather than simply useful. He asked about her father's law practice, about Philadelphia, about what it was like to read Latin and French, about whether she had ever left Pennsylvania before this. His questions were never probing, they were just interested. And in answering them, she found herself talking more freely than she had with anyone in recent memory. It was Thatcher who first noticed what she was doing with the land grant papers. She had asked Cade carefully on the fourth day whether she could look at the documentation for the ranch. She said she was trying to understand how property worked out here, which was true as far as it went. Cade had set the folder on the table without comment or question and gone back to sharpening a blade. She had spent 3 evenings with those papers. The grant was legitimate, the boundaries clear, the recording properly done. But in the language of the grazing rights agreement with the Langford Cattle Company, a document she almost set aside as routine, she found the same kind of obscured clause she had seen in Orrin Voss's marriage contract. Language that seemed to reference one thing while legally committing to another. She rewrote it on a clean sheet of paper in plain terms and left it on the table. Cade found it at breakfast, read it again. said nothing for a long moment, then looked at her across the table. How did you know to look for that? My father's practice handled estate law, she said. I grew up watching him read documents other people had already read and missed. He said the dangerous language was always buried in the third thing. Never the first, never the second, always the third. Cade folded the paper and set it in his breast pocket. It stayed there for the rest of the day. That evening after dinner, when the fire had settled and the wind had picked up its nightly argument with the canyon walls, Cade told her the truth about who they were. He did not preface it or apologize for it. He simply told her because she had earned it. They were not simply ranchers who had come west looking for land. In 1882, all four brothers had been contracted as investigators for the federal land office in Wyoming Territory, tracking fraudulent land grants, forged surveys, and the organized theft of grazing rights by the large cattle consortiums moving in from the east. They had been good at it. They had built a case over 18 months that implicated 3 senators, 2 federal judges, and a network of attorneys stretching from Cheyenne to Washington. 2 weeks before they were scheduled to present their findings, the case was sealed and classified. Their contracts were terminated. They were told by a man who had the particular pleasantness of someone who believes they cannot be touched, that any attempt to bring their evidence forward independently would result in criminal charges being filed against them for fraud and malfeasance. The evidence they had spent 18 months gathering would, the man explained, be reinterpreted. Dead Man's Canyon was not a choice. It was a retreat. They had come here because there was nowhere else to go, where the men they had exposed couldn't easily follow. Cade told her all of this without bitterness. That was what struck her most. Not without anger. She could hear the anger beneath the words, the deep embanked kind that had long since given up on combustion in favor of something more durable. But the bitterness had been refused. He had made some decision at some point she could not identify, not to let the wrong thing done to him become the wrong thing he carried. So you've been hiding here, she said. He looked at her steadily. We've been surviving here. There's a difference. She looked around the cabin, at the books on the shelf, at the rifle above the door, at the window where the snow still fell indifferent and thorough. Not anymore, she said. He didn't respond to that, but he didn't disagree. The days that followed had a new quality to them. She began teaching them things she knew not as a transaction, but as a natural extension of what they were building together. How to read a contract for hidden obligation. How to identify when legal language was designed to confuse rather than clarify. How to construct a written account of events that would hold up under examination. Cade was the fastest student. Soren asked the most precise questions. Flint learned by arguing with the text until he had bent it to his understanding. Thatcher retained everything but pretended to retain less, which she recognized as a habit developed in situations where appearing to know less than you did had been a survival strategy. She understood that instinct. She had used it herself. 3 weeks passed. December hardened around them. The cold became a constant presence, not aggressive but absolute, the way serious things become when they have been there long enough. The canyon walls held the cold the way stone holds temperature, evenly, deeply resistant to change. Willa was in the barn with Soren on a Tuesday morning, checking the horses after a particularly heavy overnight snowfall, when she heard Flint's whistle from outside. Not a casual sound, a specific pattern, 2 short, 1 long. She had heard them practice it once idly without explanation. She had filed it away. Soren's face changed. He moved to the barn's small window, the one that faced the canyon mouth, and looked for exactly 2 seconds before stepping back. How many, he said low, and even though there was no one else in the barn. He said it the way a man asks a question whose answer he has already begun preparing for. His hands were steady. His face had gone somewhere specific, not blank, but operational. She recognized it as a face he had worn before, in conditions she didn't yet know about. A lot, she said, because she had looked too. The riders came down the canyon approach in a wide formation, not rushing, not hiding. 50 men at least, spread across the snow in a pattern that suggested someone had organized them. They wore heavy winter coats. They carried rifles. They moved with the purposeful unhurriedness of people who believed the outcome was already decided. At the head of the column rode a man she didn't know, big, gray-bearded, with the kind of face that had stopped being readable years ago. Behind him, mounted on a horse too fine for this terrain, in traveling clothes that cost more than most South Pass city residents earned in a year, was Harlan Voss. He was thinner than she remembered, Or perhaps it was the mountain light, which did not flatter and did not pretend. He sat his horse the way he did everything with the careful poise of a man who understood that how you appear is a kind of argument. She had been gone 32 days. He had found her in 32 days. What happened in the next 4 minutes was remarkably quiet given its content. Flint and Thatcher appeared from the woodpile. Cade emerged from the cabin with his rifle already in hand. Soren took Willa's arm, not roughly, but with clear direction, toward the cabin. She went without arguing because she was already thinking. Inside, Cade moved to the front window. His brothers arranged themselves with the ease of men who had rehearsed this or something like it too many times to require rehearsal anymore. The gray-bearded man's voice carried across the snow, clear and practiced, the voice of someone accustomed to being heard. "Callister, we know she's in there. Send her out and we walk away." Cade's face said nothing. "Who is he?" Willa asked. "Dex Langley," Thatcher said from the side window. "His is the Langford Cattle Company, the one in your contract. He runs hired men for the consortium. The same consortium from the federal case," she said. It was not a question. Cade's single nod confirmed it anyway. "So Harlan Voss found me," she said, thinking aloud. "And then he found the people who already had a reason to want you gone. They made a single operation out of two separate grudges." "That's right," Soren said. She moved to the window and looked out past Cade's shoulder. Harlan had not moved forward. He sat his horse at a careful distance, letting Langley do the work, which was entirely consistent with everything she knew of him. He was a man who arranged for things to be done. He did not do them himself, but he was watching the cabin. And even across 60 yards of snow, she knew he was watching specifically for her. She thought about the journal, about the 2 sets of bones and the 2 pieces of jewelry, and the 2 dates recorded in handwriting so neat and orderly it had looked like bookkeeping. About Eleanor and Margaret, who had not been taken out back and shot, who had been buried under roses and watered into the earth until the flowers bloomed red come spring. She thought about Dex Langley out there in the snow, with 50 men who were being paid to do something they had not been told the full story of. She thought about what her father had always said: the most powerful room in any building is not the one where the money is kept. It's the one where people find out they've been lied to. "I need 90 seconds outside," she said. All 4 brothers looked at her. "With a white cloth," she said. "I need 90 seconds in a piece of white cloth." Cade's expression did not change, but something moved behind it. "No," he said. "I'm not asking permission," she said, and the way she said it was not defiant. It was simply accurate. "I'm telling you what I'm going to do and why. Listen." They listened. She told them what she had seen in the 3rd schedule of the 3rd appendix of the Langford Grazing Rights Agreement. She told them what she had seen in Orrin Voss's correspondence folder. She told them what she knew about how men like Orrin Voss operated, how they arranged things in layers specifically so that each layer could be denied, discarded, or redirected if something went wrong. The men outside, she said, believed they were participating in a retrieval operation. A woman recovered a property dispute, settled a fee paid. They did not know what Harlan Voss did with his wives. They did not know that Senator Orrin Voss's standard practice with contractors who knew too much was elimination after completion. "Langley doesn't know he's being used," she said. "He thinks he's the one using Voss." Cade studied her. "Even if that's true, even if you go out there, he might shoot you before you finish the first sentence." "Then I'll have made a mistake," she said. "But Harlan Voss will not let Langley shoot me in front of 50 witnesses. I'm his purpose for being here. Without me alive, he has nothing to show for this expedition." A long silence. Thatcher said, "She's right about Voss." Flint said nothing. His jaw was set. His eyes were on the window. Soren looked at her, reading something in her that the others were reading differently. He said 90 seconds. The white cloth was a piece of clean linen from the supply shelf. She tied it to the end of a broom handle and went out the front door. The cold hit her without apology. She walked forward 10 paces and stopped. The sound across the snow changed. Movement, repositioning the creak of saddle leather. But no shots. She had calculated correctly on that, at least. She looked past Dex Langley. She looked directly at Harlan Voss. He had not changed in a month. Careful poise, measured smile. The smile that never reached the amber of his eyes. Then she looked back at Langley. She spoke clearly and without theatrics, because theatrics were for people who weren't sure of their ground. She was sure of her ground. She told him who Harlan Voss was, not what he had done to her, not yet. She told him who Orrin Voss was. She described specifically the language in the grazing rights agreement. She described what that language actually committed Langley's company to stripped of the obscuring clauses. She told him that in her experience, and she named her father's profession, his decades of practice, men like Orrin Voss used contractors for as long as they were useful and then removed them before they became liabilities. She said, "You have 50 men here who can testify to what they were hired to do. Senator Voss cannot let 50 men who know his business walk back down this mountain. I think you already know that. I think that's why you haven't moved yet." Langley's gray-bearded face was stone. She heard Harlan Voss's voice from across the snow, pleasant and terrible Willa. "That's enough." She turned and walked back to the cabin. The first shot came 8 minutes later. What followed was not a battle in any dramatic sense. It was a siege systematic patient designed to compress options until there were none. The cabin's log walls held. The Callister brothers moved between windows with an efficiency that spoke of exactly what Kate had told her. These were not simply ranch hands. They had trained for this kind of work. They had done it before. But there were 50 men and 4 of them, and mathematics is the most indifferent force in nature. Flint took a bullet through the left shoulder 40 minutes in. He registered it as an inconvenience, pressed his back against the wall beside the window, looked at the wound with the empirical interest of someone checking a fence post, and said, "Soren." Soren was already moving. This was the first time she saw what Soren had been carrying. He worked on the wound with complete steadiness. His hands did not shake. His movements were economical, practiced the specific economy of someone who had done this under worse conditions than a siege. He packed the wound and bound it and said a few quiet words to Flint that she could not hear. Then he picked up his rifle and went back to the window. But 30 minutes later, something shifted. She could not have said exactly what triggered it. A particular pattern of gunfire, a sound from outside that resembled something older and farther away. Whatever it was, she saw it happen. Soren at the north window went somewhere else. His body was present, but the essential part of him that had traveled fast and without warning to another time and another field. The rifle in his hands did not move. His eyes were open. But he was at Cold Harbor, Virginia in June of 1864, and the man at the window was a ghost of who he had been before that field. She moved to him. She did not touch him. She said his name once, the way you place a hand on a sleeper's shoulder, firm enough to reach but careful enough not to frighten. Soren. He came back slowly, a man returning through fog. "Soren," she said again, "I need you here." His eyes focused. He looked at her. Something passed through his face that she would not describe to anyone, because some things are not hers to describe. He looked back out the window. He raised the rifle. She returned to her position. An hour into the siege, Thatcher appeared from the back room with a hand-drawn diagram of the canyon ridge above them. He spread it on the table. His voice was completely steady, which was the thing she remembered most about that moment. Not what he said, but that his voice was completely steady. 3 weeks ago, when the brothers had first assessed the canyon's defensive possibilities, they had placed charges on the upper ridge, a precaution never expected to be used. The charges were connected to a detonator wire that ran down the south face to a trigger point inside the cabin. If the charges blew, the overhang above the canyon approach would collapse. A controlled avalanche, controlled in the sense that it would bury the approach, not the cabin itself. Flint pulled himself up from where he had been resting against the wall, face pale, arm bound. He looked at the diagram. He looked at his brothers. "The wire," he said. Thatcher had already seen it. 2 hours into the siege, a stray round had cut the detonator wire where it crossed an exposed section of the south wall. The trigger inside the cabin was useless. To set off the charges now, someone would need to reach the south wall junction, 30 yards across open ground, and connect the wire manually. Manual connection with a direct match or a short fuse. Close range, no cover, no time to get clear. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Cade said, "It's not going to be one of you." He was looking at his brothers. He was not including himself in that category for reasons he did not state. Thatcher said quietly, "Cade." Cade said no. There was a silence between them that held years in it. She watched the 4 of them communicate in the way that people communicate who have been the same age in the same place for their entire lives, who have finished each other's thoughts so many times the mechanism has become invisible. Then Thatcher folded the diagram. He tucked it inside his coat. He looked at Willa. His grin when it came was the real version. Not the one that was slightly too easy, not the performance of ease. The actual thing, the one underneath. I want you to know something, he said. He said it simply as a man states a fact he wants on record. I'm glad you came. I'm glad Myrtle found you. He looked at Cade, then Flint, then Soren, who had come back from the ridge at Cold Harbor and was standing fully present and fully there. You take care of her, Thatcher said. All right, that's what I need. Cade's face was stone, but a very particular kind of stone. The kind that is stone because it has chosen to be because the alternative is worse. All right, he said. Thatcher crossed the cabin and she caught his arm. He looked down at her. Something shifted. His face opened in a way she had not yet seen it open. She said, you don't have to. He said, yes, I do. And I'm all right with it, Willa. That's what I want you to know. I am genuinely all right with it. He looked at the four walls of the cabin. Look what we built in 3 weeks. Just imagine what you'll build in 30 years. He pulled his arm gently free. He went out the back low, using the smoke and the confusion at the front of the cabin as cover. She watched through the narrow rear window. He moved across the snow at a run, hunched impossibly fast for a man his size, the white ground making him visible against the dark rock of the canyon wall. He reached the south junction. She saw him kneel. She saw him work. She pressed her palm flat against the log wall of the cabin, and she watched him. He looked up once back toward the cabin, and she could not see his face at that distance, but she held still anyway, as if holding still were a form of being with him. Then he lit the fuse. The explosion was not like thunder. It was more fundamental than thunder, a sound that came through the ground before it came through the air, a deep and absolute percussion that she felt in her sternum and in the floor beneath her feet simultaneously. The ridge above the canyon approached, dissolved. Tons of snow and rock came down in a wave that seemed for one suspended moment to move slowly, the way very large things sometimes appear to move slowly because the mind cannot process their scale in real time. Then it was fast, then it was over. The silence that followed was the loudest thing she had ever heard. Dust and snow and the smell of cold stone split open. The canyon approach was gone. Where 50 men had been there was a flat white field unmarked, as if nothing had ever stood there. She looked for Thatcher. She looked for a long time. Cade's hand on her shoulder did not turn her away from the window. It just stayed there, present, acknowledging. The cabin was partly buried. The force of the avalanche had pushed a wave of compacted snow against the north and west walls. The roof had shed its load correctly. The design had accounted for that, but the door was blocked. The single rear window showed only white. Cade's voice in the sudden silence was completely level. Take inventory, he said. What do we have? What do we need? Flint began to answer. Soren was already at the supply shelf. The lamp was still burning. The fireplace still drew. Then from outside the north wall, muffled by the snow but audible, close a voice. Harlan Voss had been at the rear of the column when the ridge came down. Far enough back, alive. His voice came through the snow with the pleasantness that was worse than anger, that had always been worse than anger. Willa, he said it the way you say the name of something you own. Patient, assured. I can wait. You know that about me. I am very good at waiting. The lamp on the table burned. The fire drew. Cade looked at Flint, at Soren, at Willa. Then he said, we start digging in the morning. 3 days to reach the surface. Maybe 2 if we work without stopping. He did not say anything else about the voice outside. He did not need to. What was outside the snow was a problem for a man who could be reached. What was inside the cabin, the 4 of them, 2 lanterns, enough food for a week, and everything they had already survived to get here was a different kind of arithmetic entirely. Willa sat down at the table. She opened her father's Bible to a page she had not chosen and looked at the words without reading them and let the silence settle around her like a thing that could be lived in. She was still alive. That was, as her father had always said, the necessary beginning of every plan. They dug for 3 days. Not continuously, the human body requires sleep even under siege, even buried under 20 feet of compacted snow, with a voice occasionally pressing through the outer wall like a thumb against a bruise. but close enough to continuous that afterward, when Willa tried to remember those 72 hours in any organized way, they came back to her not as separate moments, but as a single sustained effort, like a long note held on an instrument until the breath behind it finally gives. Cade had assessed the situation within the first hour with the same methodical clarity he brought to everything. The stovepipe was intact. He checked it first because the stovepipe was... Life was there, was the difference between a tomb and a shelter. He cleared it to the outside with a length of wire and confirmed the draw. The fire stayed, the air stayed, the lamp oil would last 4 days, maybe 5 if they were disciplined. Food was not the problem. Water was not the problem. The problem was the weight of the snow against the north and west walls, which was not yet structural, but would become so within a week if the temperature dropped significantly and the pack hardened. They needed to be out in 3 days. So they dug. Soren fashioned 2 tools from the fireplace implements, the poker reshaped with pliers into a narrow pick, the coal scuttle converted into a scoop. Flint, despite his wounded shoulder, worked with his right arm and did not complain about it once. Willa moved snow in the cooking pot when there was nothing else to move it in trip after trip. From the tunnel faced to the corner of the main room, they had designated as the dump, packing it against the east wall in a low berm that gradually took up more and more of the floor. The work was meditative in its way. That was the thing nobody would have predicted, least of all her. The absolute necessity of it cleared the mind of everything that was not immediately relevant. There was no room for grief while you were moving snow by the potful. Grief required a certain amount of vacancy, and the tunnel gave you none. She thought about Thatcher. She thought about him the way you think about something you are not yet ready to think about, directly, obliquely, in quick passes, like looking at a bright thing from the corner of your eye. She thought about his voice, the particular steadiness of it in the last minutes, the grin underneath the grin. I am genuinely all right with it. She believed that he had been. She did not yet know how to hold that fact without it hurting. She suspected that was something time would teach her, and that the teaching would take longer than she wanted it to. On the second night, when the others slept and only the fire kept her company, she sat at the table with her father's Bible open before her and did not read it. She held the conversation with him instead, the silent kind, the true kind, the kind that didn't require him to be anywhere near alive. She told him she thought she understood now what he had tried to teach her. Not the specific lessons, the legal terminology, the contract language, the way fraudulent clauses nested inside legitimate ones like parasites inside a healthy host. Those were instruments. What he had been teaching her all those years of sitting at his elbow while he worked was something more fundamental, that language was the most powerful weapon ever devised by human beings, that the people who controlled language controlled everything else, and that the only defense against the misuse of language was the patient, unromantic, unglamorous work of learning to read it precisely. He had been teaching her to be dangerous. She thought he would have been satisfied to know she finally was. On the morning of the third day, Cade's improvised pick broke through into cold, open air. The light that came in was extraordinary. After 72 hours of lamplight and firelight, the thin winter sun coming through a hole, the diameter of a man's fist was the most violent brightness she had ever experienced. She pressed her eye to it and saw sky pale blue, high and cold, and completely indifferent, and felt something release in her chest that she had not known she was holding. They widened the opening over 4 hours and climbed out into a canyon transformed. Dead Man's Canyon was gone. In its place was a long, smooth white field that sloped gently where the approach had been. The rock walls on either side still stood. The cabin roof was visible above the snow line, a dark rectangle against white. Of the 50 men who had ridden in 3 days ago, there was nothing visible at all. Willa stood on top of the snowpack and turned slowly, checking all directions. At the edge of the tree line, 40 yards east, a figure sat on a downed log. Dex Langley was a gray-bearded man, without his horse, without his coat, without his rifle, wearing the expression of someone who has had 3 days buried alone in his own thoughts and has arrived at conclusions he would have preferred not to reach. He was alive because he had been at the extreme rear of the column when the ridge came down, and because a large boulder had created a pocket of air and space around him as the snow settled, and because he was by any measure a physically durable man. He stood when they came out. His hands were visible, empty. He looked at Willa specifically. He said, "You were right about the letter." He reached inside his coat and produced a folded envelope, water-stained but intact. He held it out. She crossed the snow and took it. The letter was from Senator Orrin Voss, written in a precise legal hand on Senate stationery. It was addressed to Langley personally and dated 3 weeks prior. It confirmed the contracted fee for the retrieval operation, and then in the third paragraph, always the third always, it described the necessary secondary phase of the operation to be completed after the primary objective was secured. The language was oblique but specific to someone who knew how to read it. The secondary phase involved the elimination of operational witnesses to preserve deniability of the senator's involvement. 50 men, including Langley. She read it twice. Then she folded it and put it in her coat pocket next to the marriage certificate and the folded copy of the Langford grazing base agreement she had carried with her since the night before the siege. "I want to make a deal," Langley said. His voice was rough from cold and from something else, the roughness of a man who has spent 3 days alone with an uncomfortable truth and has run out of arguments against it. Cade said, "Talk." Langley talked. He would provide written testimony, not just about this operation, about all of it. He had worked for the Voss Consortium for 11 years. He knew where the money moved, which judges had been paid, which federal contracts had been falsified, which land surveys bore signatures that had never been given freely. He knew the names of the men who had buried the Callisters' federal case in 1882. He knew because he had been paid at various points to apply pressure to various individuals involved in keeping it buried. He said all of this in the flat, factual tone of a man delivering a contractor's assessment. No guilt particularly, but no evasion either. Flint said quietly, and Voss Langley looked east toward the direction in which 3 days ago a man in expensive traveling clothes had been standing when the ridge came down. "He came through the rear, same as me," Langley said. "He had a horse. I didn't. He rode east when it was over. He's gone. Gone." The words settled in the cold air and dissolved. Willa thought, "He is good at waiting. He said so himself." She thought, "So am I." The journey back to South Pass City took 8 days. 85 miles in December in the mountains with no horses, no snowshoes. One man with a shoulder wound. One man who carried the weight of an old Virginia battlefield in ways he had not yet spoken aloud. One man still finding his footing after 3 days entombed in snow, and Willa, who had lost 2 toes on her left foot to frostbite on the 4th day, and had not mentioned it until Soren noticed her gait changing and made her stop. The frostbite was not as bad as it might have been. Soren treated it with what he had, which was less than he wanted and more than nothing, and they kept moving. The cold was a presence rather than a condition, something they moved through rather than something that acted on them. At night, they built fires from whatever could be found and pressed together for warmth with the uncomplicated necessity of people whose other options have been removed. On the first night after the fire was established and Flint and Soren slept, Cade sat beside her on a fallen pine and looked at the stars for a while. The sky out here, away from any lamp or window, was something she had never seen before coming west. It had depth. It was not a flat ceiling, but a volume receding backward into something that made distance meaningless. She said, "I need to tell you something about my father." He waited. She told him about the debt that had appeared from nowhere, about the way the legal practice had been absorbed step by step, transaction by transaction, by entities that traced back at enough removes to the Voss family's holding companies. About the timing, how the financial dismantling of Solomon Ashford had begun not after his diagnosis, but 2 years before it. How the diagnosis itself had come from a physician who, as she now knew, retained by the Voss family. How arsenic poisoning in its chronic form presented symptoms that a general practitioner in 1885 would have attributed without particular suspicion to progressive lung disease. She said the word arsenic clearly without drama because it was a fact, and facts deserve their right names. Cade was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Your father didn't lose his fortune, and he didn't die of illness." "No," she said. He looked at the fire. When he spoke again, his voice was even but very low. "Orrin Voss built the cage around you before you knew you were in one." "Yes." She watched the fire. The pine sap popped and hissed. She said, "I need to prove it. Not for myself. For him. He died not knowing what was done to him. He died thinking he had simply failed. I need to make it a matter of record. I need it written down in a court document where it cannot be taken back or buried or reclassified." Cade looked at her. Then we will, he said. Not we'll try. Not that may be difficult. Just then we will. She understood in that moment what Myrtle Beckham had seen in her letter. Not the desperation, though the desperation was there. The part underneath the desperation, the part that was still operating, still thinking, still reaching towards something precise and difficult and necessary. Myrtle had read that part and bought a train ticket. She was glad. She was unexpectedly, thoroughly glad. They arrived in South Pass City on December 28, 1887. Myrtle Beckham saw them from her kitchen window when they came down the main street and was outside before they reached the door, moving faster than a woman of her age and build should have been able to move. She looked at the three brothers and then at Willa, and then said plainly, "Where is Thatcher gone?" Kate said. The same word Langley had used. It carried different weight coming from him. Myrtle's face did what faces do when they absorbed something they had feared was coming. She pressed her lips together. She breathed once. Then she stepped back and held the door open. "Come inside," she said, "all of you." She fed them first. Then she let the doctor and a young man named Aldous Pruitt, who had come to South Pass City 2 years prior and had the combination of competence and adaptability that frontier medicine required. He treated Flint's shoulder, which was infected, but not critically so, and confirmed Willa's assessment of her own frostbite. 2 toes. The tissue damage was significant, but the toes would remain. She would walk differently for a while, and then mostly not. Langley made his statement to the town marshal that same evening. He was specific, organized, and thorough, in the way of a man who has decided that his only remaining asset is information and intends to make it count. The marshal sent a wire to the federal land office in Cheyenne the following morning. The territorial reward for information leading to conviction of the Langford Cattle Company's fraudulent land operations was $12,000 paid in 2 installments. The first arrived in March of 1888, the second in July. They used the money to buy 600 acres in Wind River Valley, 30 miles north of South Pass City. Good land, grass that came up thick in spring, a creek that ran clear year-round, a south-facing slope that held warmth longer than the surrounding terrain. They built first a barn, then a cabin, larger than Dead Man's Canyon had been, then a proper house with 4 bedrooms and a kitchen with 2 windows. The 4th bedroom they left as it was. No furniture except a single chair. On the chair, a folded handkerchief that had been Thatcher's. On the wall above it, nothing. The room did not need anything on the wall. What it held was already there. The work of building consumed 1888 entirely and most of 1889. Willa worked alongside the brothers in the ways she always had, physically willingly, without making a ceremony of it. She also worked in the ways that were specific to her. She wrote letters, many letters to many people in many cities, to the Philadelphia Hall of Records, to the Pennsylvania Bar Association's Ethics Committee, to a private investigator in Washington whose name she had found in her father's old correspondence, to a physician in Boston who had published papers on the diagnostic presentation of chronic arsenic exposure, and who wrote back within 3 weeks with a letter that was, she would later think, the first brick in a very particular wall. She built the case the way her father had built cases, patiently, without announcement, piece by piece verifying each element before moving to the next, understanding that a structure built on verified facts was the only kind that would stand. In the spring of 1889, she realized she was pregnant. She told all 3 of them together at dinner in the straightforward way she had come to do most things. There was a silence that was not uncomfortable, a silence of the kind that contains too many things to be expressed quickly and so expresses nothing while it sorts itself out. Then Flint said, "Boy or girl, I don't know yet," she said. "I'll let you know when I do." Thatcher Cade Callister was born in November of 1889. He came into the world with the amber eyes common to all the Callister brothers, and with a disposition that Myrtle Beckham, who was present for the birth, and several hours after it identified within the first week as belonging to a specific type. That one, Myrtle said, watching the infant with the experienced eye of a woman who had seen many, is going to be trouble. The cheerful kind. "Yes," Willa said, "I know." She had known since the first morning she woke up to find that the baby, in whatever mysterious way babies accomplish things before they are capable of accomplishing anything, had shifted in the night to face east toward the window where the morning light came in first. Toward the light. Of course, she named him for his uncle, without discussion, because no discussion was required. All 3 brothers understood, and the understanding needed no words around it. In the spring of 1890, a man arrived at the Wind River Valley Ranch on a government horse. His name was Forrest Hale, and he was a special investigator attached to the Attorney General's office in Washington. He was a thin man of about 50, with reading glasses he wore on a cord around his neck, and the permanent ink stain of a man who spent most of his life with documents. He did not look like what he was, which was, she would discover, a deliberate professional choice. He sat at her kitchen table and drank coffee and said, "Mrs. Callister, I've been reading your correspondence for approximately a year. I want to discuss your father." She set down her own cup and said, "Good." What he told her confirmed what she had built the case to confirm, but confirmation is different from knowing. She had known. She had been as certain as a person can be without the official weight of a federal investigation behind the certainty. But having it confirmed, hearing a federal investigator say in the careful language of his profession that the evidence supported her theory that the physician retained by Voss had administered arsenic compounds through a course of treatment that lasted 14 months, that Solomon Ashford had not died of lung disease, but had been murdered in a particularly patient and calculated fashion 2 years before it became convenient for Orrin Voss to formalize the theft of his estate, hearing that said out loud in her kitchen over coffee, with the morning light coming through the east windows and little Thatcher asleep in the next room. She pressed the back of her hand to her mouth, not weeping. She did not weep in front of Forrest Hale, whom she had met 40 minutes ago. But something moved through her that needed a moment of acknowledgement before it could be filed and used. He gave her the moment without comment. He was a professional. Then she straightened and set her hand flat on the table and said, "What do you need from me?" What followed took 2 years. Harlan Voss was located in Denver in the spring of 1892, where he had been living quietly under his mother's maiden name, which suggested a level of premeditation that the prosecution would later make considerable use of. He was arrested without incident in April, which the arresting marshal described afterward as almost disappointing. Harlan had opened his hotel room door in a silk dressing gown, taken one look at the badge and said only, "I'd like to send a letter before we go." The letter, intercepted per standard procedure, was to his father. It contained 4 words: "I told you this." Senator Orrin Voss was arrested at his Philadelphia office 6 hours later. He did not open the door quietly. He required 3 marshals and a very specific written order from a federal judge, which Forrest Hale had prepared in advance because he had anticipated exactly this. The 4th wife, a woman named Helen Whitaker Voss, who had been found by Willa's investigator in a boarding house in Baltimore 14 months prior, and whose ongoing correspondence with Willa had produced, among other things, a written account of what she had seen in the cellar of the Voss estate before she had managed to escape, agreed to testify. The trial was held in Philadelphia in the autumn of 1892. Willa traveled east for the first time since the night she had walked out of the servants' gate with a trunk and a train ticket and 21 days to live. She made the journey alone. Not because the brothers hadn't offered, but because this was a thing she needed to do in a particular way, and the particular way required her to walk into that courtroom as herself, not as someone's wife, not as someone under protection, not as someone who needed accompanying. She sat in the anteroom outside the courtroom on the first morning of the trial and looked at her hands in her lap for a while. Her hands were different from the hands she had left Philadelphia with 5 years ago. The skin was rougher. There was a scar on her right thumb from a saw accident in the second winter of building. The 2 toes on her left foot, which had never quite regained their full sensation, made her balance slightly different on the left side, which meant she stood differently than she once had, more deliberate, more planted. She thought she looked like someone who had been somewhere and done things. She thought her father would have recognized her. She went into the courtroom. The prosecution had structured its case in the methodical sequence that good prosecution requires: establishing the bodies, establishing the journal, establishing the means and pattern and history of Harlan Voss's crimes. Helen Whitaker Voss testified first, and she did it with the courage of someone who has been afraid for a very long time and has decided that the fear, however real, is no longer the most important thing. Then Willa was called. She had testified in civil matters twice before accompanying her father. She understood the form, the oath, the questions, the requirement to answer what was asked, and not more the way a good attorney built their examination towards something and a bad one scattered it. She had read the prosecution's questions in advance. She sat in the witness chair and looked at the room. Harlan Voss was at the defense table. He was well-dressed because he was always well-dressed. He was looking at her with the measured, careful attention he had always given her, the attention of someone assessing rather than seeing. His expression was composed. His expression was always composed. Senator Orrin Voss sat beside him. He was smaller than she remembered, or perhaps he only seemed smaller here in this room, with this much documented truth arrayed against him on a prosecutor's table. She answered the questions. She described the garden. She described the bones and the jewelry and the inscriptions. She described finding the journal and what the journal contained. She described the safe in the marriage contract and the property transfer clause in the third schedule of the third appendix. Then the prosecutor asked her a question that was not on the list they had reviewed together. "Mrs. Callister," he said, "in your assessment, based on the documents you examined, who bears primary responsibility for the events you have described?" She understood what he was doing. He was giving her the floor. He had decided at some point in the preparation of this case that the most effective closing argument for the prosecution was not a closing argument at all. It was this woman in this chair answering this question. She looked at Orrin Voss. She said Senator Voss designed the entire operation. His son executed the domestic component. But the structure, the manufactured debt, the targeted acquisition of my father's estate, the deliberate isolation of my father's family, the selection of victims who had no one to ask questions on their behalf, that structure required legal sophistication, political access, and patience spanning years. That is not the work of one man acting impulsively. That is architecture. She paused. She said, "My father was murdered 26 months before I found the first body in that garden. He died not knowing what had been done to him. He died believing he had failed to protect his family. The record of this court should reflect that he did not fail. He was systematically dismantled by people who were very good at making theft look like accident and murder look like illness. The record should say that plainly." The courtroom was quiet. Orrin Voss was looking at his hands. Harlan Voss was still looking at her. His expression had finally, for the first time in her experience of him, become something she could read. He was afraid. Good, she thought. That is the correct response. Harlan Voss was convicted on 2 counts of murder in the first degree in October of 1892. Senator Orrin Voss was convicted on 4 counts, including conspiracy to commit murder, fraudulent property acquisition, and the deliberate poisoning of Solomon Ashford. Harlan was sentenced to death. The sentence was carried out in April of 1893. Senator Voss died in Moyamensing Prison in June of 1894 before his own scheduled execution. His heart, the prison physician reported, had simply stopped. By order of the federal court, the assets held in the Voss family's legal structures that could be traced to the Ashford estate were identified, valued, and returned. The amount accounting for the property and the legal practice receivables in the private investment account she had not known existed came to $51,000. She received the bank draft on a Tuesday in September of 1894. She sat with it at the kitchen table for a long time before she folded it and put it in the drawer with her father's Bible. Then she went outside and found Cade splitting wood by the barn and stood beside him for a while without speaking. He set down the axe. He said, "Is it done, yes?" She said. He looked at her the way he had always looked at her, with that Cade Callister quality of attention that was neither gentle nor aggressive, but simply complete, the way a good craftsman examines something he intends to understand. "All right," he said. They stood together in the autumn afternoon, the mountains around them still holding their summer green in the lower elevations, while the peaks above had begun their first frost. She could hear the creek from where they stood. She could hear Thatcher, nearly 5 years old, noisy, absolutely himself, somewhere near the barn. She thought, "I am 29 years old. I have been a wife for 7 years. I have a son with amber eyes and a laugh that belongs to the man who died, so we could have this afternoon. I have 2 toes that don't quite work right, and a scar on my thumb and hands that know what they are for. I have 3 husbands who are the same man and in 4 different ways, and none of them. I have 600 acres of good Wyoming land and a creek that runs clear year-round. I have $51,000 in a bank draft in my kitchen drawer. And I have my father's name on a court document with the truth of what happened to him written in the plain language of law, irrevocable, permanent, a matter of public record. It counts for something," she had told him on the train. Myrtle had said, then we will make sure it counts. It counted. Spring 1897, Wind River Valley. The morning came in slowly feeling its way through the east windows, the way light did here, not sudden, not aggressive, just gradually brightening the room until there was enough of it to see by. Willa had always liked this. She had grown up in a city where curtains were drawn against the morning, where light arrived at the decision of whoever opened the window. Here the light came on its own terms. She was on the porch before the others were fully awake. Thatcher Cade was 7 now, nearly 8, and he had his uncle's structural grin and his uncle's inability to remain in one place for longer than 2 minutes, and his uncle's specific gift for finding the exact thing that would make a room's atmosphere lift without anyone being able to identify precisely what he had done. He was in the meadow already doing something involving a stick and a great deal of personal conviction. Behind him came the twins Grace and May, 5 years old, in their particular formation, which was Grace first and May 2 steps behind, using Grace's momentum as a kind of windbreak, the way small animals learn to travel. Behind them came Samuel, 2.5 stout and determined, moving through the tall grass with the profound seriousness of a person who has decided that walking is something that deserves full commitment. She watched them and held her coffee cup with both hands and let the morning be what it was. Flint came out first because Flint was always first after her. He stood beside her and looked at the meadow and said nothing, which was how Flint showed appreciation for things he found genuinely good. His shoulder had healed cleanly. He stood straighter than he used to, which she thought had less to do with the shoulder and more to do with 10 years of building something real on solid ground. Soren came out next with his own coffee and stood on her other side and looked at the children the way he had looked at everything since the valley came back to him, with the gratitude of a man who understands what it costs to be present and chooses to pay it anyway. He had talked to her over the years about Cold Harbor. Not often, not in detail, but enough. She thought talking about it had not fixed anything but had perhaps given it a room of its own where it could live without taking up the whole house. Cade came last. He stood behind her, close, but not touching in the way he had always positioned himself, present, unobtrusive, reliable in the way that the mountains around them were reliable. She had come to understand over 10 years that his silences were not distance. They were the opposite of distance. They were Cade's most direct form of closeness, simply being entirely in a place without performance or agenda. He said eventually, I've been thinking about the upper pasture. She said, I know, the fence along the north edge. He said, it won't hold another winter. She said, no, we should extend it west anyway. Give the stock more room before the snow. He said, I'll take Flint up tomorrow. She said, take Soren. Flint's going to South Pass City tomorrow. He promised May he'd get her the red ribbon she asked for. A brief silence. Cade said Flint agreed to that. Willa said Flint would walk through that snow barefoot if May asked him to, and you know it. Something in Cade's posture shifted in the way that meant he was suppressing something that would not technically be a smile but would be in the vicinity. In the meadow, Thatcher Cade had now recruited both sisters into whatever operation he was running with the stick. Samuel had sat down in the grass to observe which was Samuel's preferred mode of engagement with his siblings' activities, watchful patient, waiting to see how things resolved before committing. She thought he will be a good judge, that one, or a good general. Something that requires watching first and speaking second. She thought about the fourth bedroom in the house, the chair, the handkerchief. She thought he is in all of them, in the grin that appears on Thatcher Cade's face when he has convinced his sisters into something inadvisable. In Grace's particular fearlessness, which is not recklessness, she just calculates faster than her caution catches up. In May's loyalty, which is absolute and entirely uncomplicated. In Samuel's watchfulness, he is in this morning, in the fact that this morning exists at all. She said without turning around, do you ever think about that first winter, Dead Man's Canyon? Cade said yes. She said, what do you think about? He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I think about the day you walked into the livery stable. You were the smallest person in the room by a considerable distance. She said, I remember. He said, I thought the first winter would break you. She turned her head slightly. Waited. He said, I was wrong about that. She looked back at the meadow, at her children in the morning light in the grass in the mountains of Wyoming that had tried to kill them all more than once and had not managed it. She said, you weren't wrong. The first winter did break me. I just learned that breaking isn't destruction. It's a new agreement between two things that have decided to trust each other. He was quiet with that for a while. She looked back at the meadow and let the silence settle between them, the way good silences do not as absence but as presence of a different kind. The morning light had fully arrived now, filling the valley, the way the creek filled its banks in spring quietly, persistently, without drama. Cade put his hand on her shoulder. Not dramatically, not as a statement, just the weight of his hand present and certain. She put her hand over his. In the meadow, Thatcher Cade had apparently fallen in the grass deliberately. She was certain as a tactical maneuver of some kind, and both sisters were laughing, and Samuel was still watching with that broad, considering gaze, and the mountains were still there, white at the peaks and green at the feet, the same mountains that had buried them and held them and let them climb out. Willa Mae Callister looked at all of it. She thought about this garden in Philadelphia and the bones and the locket that had read, "To Margaret forever and always." She thought about the train moving west through the October fields. She thought about a letter in a strong, plain hand that had said, "We are not gentle men, but we are honorable ones." She thought about her father who had not known what was done to him, who had died believing he had failed. He was on the court record now. His name and the truth of what happened to it, written in permanent language, in a permanent place. Not buried under roses, not dissolved into someone else's profit. On the record, in the light. That was what she had come back for. Not the money, though the money was real and the money was his, and it had built the fence and the barn and the house with the 4 bedrooms. Not the verdict, though. The verdict was just, and justice mattered. She had come back for the record. For the permanent, irrevocable fact of it, Solomon Ashford had not failed. He had been taken from. There was a difference, and now the difference was documented. She thought I carried that for him because he couldn't carry it himself. She thought that is what children are for. She thought that is what this life is for. The morning moved forward in the way mornings did, the light strengthening, the temperature rising a degree, the shadows shortening, the day becoming itself. Flint said something about breakfast. Soren went inside. Thatcher Cade came sprinting across the meadow with both sisters behind him and careened into the porch railing with the complete absence of self-preservation common to children who have never been seriously hurt and expect the world to continue accommodating them. He looked up at his mother with his uncle's grin. "Mama," he said, "Grace says the creek's too cold to wade." "Is it?" Willa looked at him. She said, "The creek is absolutely too cold to wade." He considered this for approximately 1 second. He said, "But has anyone checked?" She looked at him for a moment longer than necessary. This boy with amber eyes and his uncle's grin and his uncle's gift for finding the fault line in any argument. She said, "Go check." He was gone before the sentence was finished. Sisters in his wake, Samuel standing up from the grass to follow at his own deliberate pace. Cade from behind her, "You just sent 4 children into a cold creek." She said, "I sent 1 child into a cold creek." The other 3 made their own decision. He made the sound that was not a laugh, but lived next door to one. She had learned over 10 years to hear everything that sound contained: affection, amusement, the deep and settled satisfaction of a man who has built something that works and knows it works and no longer needs to prove it to anyone. She picked up her coffee cup, which had gone cold, and looked out at the mountains. She was 32 years old. She had 2 toes that didn't fully work and a scar on her thumb and hands that knew what they were for. She had a court document with her father's name on it and the truth written beside it in language that could not be taken back. She had 600 acres of Wyoming grass in a creek that ran clear year-round and 4 children who were currently, in all probability, standing in it. She had 3 husbands who were not gentle men. They were honorable ones. That had been enough. It had been, in the end, exactly enough. She thought about the girl she had been when she boarded a train in Philadelphia with a single trunk and a letter from a stranger and 21 days to avoid becoming the 3rd body in a garden. She thought about how that girl had made herself small and careful and invisible, had learned the sounds of floors in houses that were not hers, had pressed flower petals between pages of books, as if preserving beautiful things against their inevitable ruin. She was not that girl anymore. She was not smaller than the mountains, but she was no longer afraid of them. She stood on the porch of the house they had built together in the valley they had chosen together under the Wyoming sky that asked nothing of anyone and gave back everything, and she let the morning be what it was. From the creek 30 yards out, She could hear the sound of Thatcher Cade's voice, half indignation, half delight, as the cold water apparently confirmed what Grace had told him. Then the sound of both sisters laughing. Then Samuel's low, considered response, which was too distant to make out, but which had the cadence of someone filing the results of an experiment for future reference. Cade said from behind her hold, apparently. Yes, she said, apparently. A pause. Cade said the twins knew that before they went in. She said yes. He said, and they went anyway. She said, they're Callisters. Another silence, the good kind. Then Cade said very quietly, not as a statement requiring response, but as a thing that needed to be said out loud to be real, I am grateful every day for that letter you wrote. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, so am I. She did not elaborate because there was nothing to elaborate. The letter had been written by a girl who had run out of options, and it had been received by a man who had run out of hope. And somewhere between those two things, a life had been built that neither of them had been capable of imagining at the time. That was, she had come to believe how most good things began. Not with grand plans or clear vision, with one honest sentence sent into the dark. I have nowhere else to go. And the answer that had come back, we are not gentle men, but we are honorable ones. She set her coffee cup on the porch railing. She looked at her children, who were now mostly wet and entirely unconcerned about it moving back toward the house with the particular trajectory of people who have decided that consequences are a problem for later. She looked at the mountains, which were the same mountains they had always been indifferent, magnificent, entirely honest about what they were. She looked at the house behind her with its 4 bedrooms, one of which held a chair and a handkerchief, in a particular quality of absence that had its own kind of presence. She thought, he is in all of them. He is in this morning. She thought, we are all still here because of what he did. That is the whole truth of it, and the truth is enough. She did not want for anything that was not already here. That was the end of the fear. That was the beginning of everything else.